Let's begin with names that became legend, but whose reality was far more brutal than any myth: Read and Anne Bonny. Two women, each seemingly born to defy a world where their place was strictly defined. Read, an illegitimate daughter, wore male clothing from childhood. Her mother disguised her as her deceased son to secure an inheritance. Thus, Mary spent her youth pretending to be a boy, then a young man. She served in the army, fighting in Flanders, then in the Navy, consistently demonstrating bravery. Left destitute after her soldier husband's death, Mary, now in female attire, boarded a ship bound for the West Indies, where her vessel was captured by Captain Jack Rackham. There, she met Anne Bonny. An Irish woman and the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer, Anne was known for her incredibly wild temper from a young age. Stories of her fierce brawls circulated throughout the region. Unwilling to conform to suffocating societal norms, Anne fled home, married a sailor, and then abandoned him to live with Rackham on the Bahamian island of New Providence, a haven for privateers. She became not only his lover, but also a full member of the crew, matching the men in both audacity and cruelty. When Read joined Rackham's crew, concealing her gender, Anne Bonny was among the first to uncover her secret. Something more than rivalry blossomed between them, a camaraderie born of desperation and danger. They fought side by side, their names becoming synonymous with fearlessness in the Caribbean Sea. Tales of the two female pirates, fiercely hacking at enemies in boarding actions, turned them into legends. But behind the romantic aura of adventure lay only a ruthless struggle for survival. This is not a story of freedom or feminism, but of how two women, cornered by society, chose a path that, though it seemed to lead to independence, actually led to inevitable and brutal retribution. Their journey to a pirate ship's deck was paved not by a thirst for adventure, but by years of psychological pressure and forced decisions that, step by step, stripped them of choice. It wasn't a leap into the unknown, but rather a fall into an abyss, where the only salvation seemed to be complete transformation, an abandonment of everything that made them vulnerable in the normal world. From birth, Read was a hostage to another's lie. Her mother, desperately clinging to an inheritance, transformed her own daughter into a deceased son, condemning her to a life of constant disguise. This mask became not just clothing, but an integral part of her identity, an invisible yet pervasive prison, robbing her of the ability to be herself. The years spent in male disguise, first in the army, where she fought in Flanders, then in the Navy, were not a choice of path, but a cruel necessity for survival. Mary learned to fight, to command, to hide her true self, to live in constant tension of exposure. She honed skills that would allow her to blend in with a crowd of men, yet every moment she feared her secret would be revealed. Every step she took was on thin ice, where one wrong move could cost not only her life, but also that fragile identity built on deceit. A brief period when she tried to live a normal life, marrying a soldier, ended in tragedy. Her husband's death, and then the child she likely lost, shattered this illusion, leaving her not just destitute, but also without her usual protection, without purpose. The world that might have accepted her as a woman seemed to have slammed its doors shut. Only the world where her male persona, her skills as a soldier and sailor, forged in the crucible of deception and forced aggression, remained as her sole currency. The Caribbean Sea became not a horizon of opportunities, but a last desperate refuge where these deformed but honed abilities found their twisted application and her inner rage found an outlet. Anne Bonny, on the other hand, experienced the taste of rejection and rage from a young age. As the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer, she never fit into the societal norms imposed on women of her class. Her famous brawls, stories of which circulated widely, were not merely a display of a wild temper, but likely a desperate attempt to assert herself, to declare her existence in a world that tried to ignore, suppress, or chain her with invisible bonds of sanctimony and hypocritical virtues. Every blow, every act of defiance, was a silent scream for the right to a place in the sun, for recognition of her own strength. She did not seek approval, she demanded respect, even if through fear. Her flight from home, impulsive marriage to a sailor, and then its swift dissolution for Captain Rackham, these were not merely changes of partners or whims. They were a consistent, ruthless dismantling of all social constructs that might restrain her, a refusal of any compromise with a system that rejected her. The Bahamian New Providence became for her not just a pirate base, but an arena where she could be herself, without regard for others' expectations, without attempting to conform to imposed ideals of femininity. Here, her aggression, her lack of fear, and her readiness for violence became not vices, but valuable qualities, highly prized in a world where only the strongest survived. Both Mary and Anne arrived on Rackham's deck not as novices, but as women already broken, yet simultaneously hardened by severe trials. Their point of no return had been passed long before the first boarding. This was not a choice for romantic freedom or adventure, but a merciless consequence of a life where any attempt to conform to norms led only to suffering, rejection, or disappointment. Piracy became for them not merely a way to survive in a brutal world, but also a twisted form of self-realization, a place where their deformed personalities, their aggression, and their willingness to risk their lives finally found their purpose. Here, among society's outcasts, they found a peculiar, brutal niche where their past became their main weapon and their only defense. It was not a triumph over fate, but rather its ruthless acceptance, embodied in their bloodthirsty deeds and indomitable will to live, which proved stronger than any moral norms. Barely had the ink dried on the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which officially ended the long and bloody War of the Spanish Succession, when thousands of sailors, soldiers, and privateers found themselves ashore without work. These individuals, hardened by discipline, violence, and life on the edge, suddenly became surplus in the world that followed. Royal navies sharply downsized, and private vessels, previously engaged in legalized state-sanctioned plunder, lost their status and source of income. Governments, burdened by immense war debts, could not or would not provide for their former servants, abandoning them to their fate. Europe's economy, exhausted by decades of war, could not absorb such an influx of unemployed. Food prices inexorably rose, wages plummeted, and prospects for honest labor seemed like elusive mirages. For countless people, especially those without land, inheritance, or connections, the only way to escape starvation or perpetual debtor's prison was through crime. The colonies, especially in the West Indies, were not so much bastions of civilization as vast, chaotic frontier territories where metropolitan power was weak, and opportunities for quick, albeit illegal, gain were immense. Flourishing trade routes, carrying ships laden with jewels, spices, and goods, were poorly protected, making them easy prey for organized gangs of desperate people. The social structure of the time was rigid, an almost impenetrable wall. Birth determined destiny. If you were not born into the aristocracy or wealthy merchant class, your chances of a decent life were minuscule. For women, regardless of their origin, opportunities were even more limited and strictly regulated. Society prescribed them roles as submissive daughters, humble wives, and caring mothers, depriving them of the right to self-determination, education, or economic independence. Any, even minor, deviation from these suffocating norms was punished by ostracism, poverty, public censure, or even imprisonment. This atmosphere, where personal freedom and ambition were suppressed at every turn, created immense internal pressure, leading to despair. For those who could not or would not reconcile themselves to such a fate, desperate measures became the only conceivable way out of the trap. Against this backdrop of widespread hopelessness and injustice, the Caribbean Sea transformed into a boiling cauldron of despair and unexpected opportunities. Piracy, once a sporadic and unorganized phenomenon, became for thousands of people not merely a criminal activity, but a kind of alternative social system, offering the illusion of freedom, self-governance, and a chance for rapid enrichment. Here, there was no need for noble titles, accumulated capital, or influential patrons. Only courage, readiness for cruelty, and unconditional loyalty to the crew were valued. Pirate ships were often governed by a peculiar but effective semblance of democracy, where every crew member, from sailor to captain, had a voice and a share in the spoils, which sharply contrasted with the rigid hierarchy and unjust distribution of benefits on merchant or naval vessels. Port cities, such as the famous New Providence, despite official prohibitions, thrived on smuggling and open trade with pirates, while corrupt governors and officials turned a blind eye to lawlessness in exchange for a generous share. Thus, the Caribbean basin of the early 18th century was not just a geographical point on the map, but a unique, dynamic ecosystem where systemic violence, deep economic depression, and total social inequality created ideal conditions for an unprecedented flourishing of piracy. It was a world where law was merely a recommendation, and survival depended solely on personal strength, cunning, and a willingness to push through, even at the cost of one's soul. It was in this fertile ground, steeped in despair, a thirst for easy money, and a yearning for illusory freedom, that stories like those of Read and Anne Bonny were born and flourished, embodying not so much the romance of adventure as the ruthless spirit of an era when desperate people chose desperate paths simply to survive and, perhaps for a moment, feel masters of their own destiny. In this volatile environment, where only the most desperate survived, Read continued her grand deception. Aboard Captain Rackham's Revenge, among cutthroats who would tolerate no hint of weakness, her male persona became not just a mask, but a second, more dangerous face. She moved, spoke, and fought like a man, flawlessly imitating the mannerisms, gestures, and even the crude humor typical of pirates. This was not just a game, but a complex charade, requiring constant tension and iron self-control. Every day spent on deck was a risk of exposure, which could cost her life, or, even worse, lead to brutal torment. Her past life, full of pretense and forced aggression, became her shield and sword. She knew how to maintain distance, how to deflect suspicion, how to use her strength and agility without giving herself away. However, even the most perfect deception eventually cracks. Anne Bonny, herself a master of disguise and deceit, proved more perceptive than the others. She likely noticed subtle inconsistencies in Mary's behavior, details that escaped the eyes of men accustomed to the monotony of a male world. Perhaps it was intuition, or perhaps Anne, no stranger to observing human nature, caught something familiar in the young sailor's demeanor. Whatever the reason, she did not arrange a public exposure. Instead, Anne, driven by either curiosity or a sense of kinship with another outcast like herself, engaged Mary in a private conversation. And then, in the strictest confidence, Read revealed her secret. This was a second, no less risky act of deception, but this time a deception leading not to confrontation, but to alliance. From this moment, the third, most audacious deception began, the joint performance of two women posing as the fiercest and most ruthless pirates in the Caribbean. Mary and Anne became not just crew members, but its vanguard. They participated in boarding actions, not only matching the men, but often surpassing them in fury and effectiveness. Stories of two women fighting on par with men, and sometimes more fiercely, spread throughout the West Indies, transforming into terrifying legends. This reputation was their most powerful weapon. It sowed panic among merchant ship crews, forcing them to surrender without a fight, or demoralize the enemy when a confrontation became inevitable. Their appearance on deck, weapons in hand, in male clothing, was not just an act of violence, but a shocking spectacle that undermined all notions of femininity and masculinity of the time. This was a deception of a scale that transcended ordinary robbery. It was an assault on the very foundation of social order, where gender roles were immutable. Their behavior on deck was a carefully calculated, though instinctive performance that solidified their power and multiplied the fear they instilled. They didn't just survive, they proved that a woman could be as, or even more, dangerous than any man if circumstances cornered her. This display of strength and fearlessness was, in essence, a continuous mystification that ensured their survival in a world where their true nature would have been a death sentence. Their survival, however, depended not only on their hidden gender or physical strength. Mary Read and Anne Bonny, each in her own way, masterfully wielded the art of manipulation and psychological pressure, transforming their own vulnerability into a source of undeniable power and fear into a formidable tool for controlling their surroundings. In a world where every step could be their last, their main weapon turned out to be less the cutlass than the ability to manage perception. Mary Read, having spent her entire life in disguise, honed the ability to be both inconspicuous and terrifying. Her male persona aboard the Revenge was not just protection, but a carefully constructed facade that worked on multiple levels. She not only impeccably imitated male mannerisms, from crude speech to how she held a weapon, but also displayed unprecedented composure in battle. This was a conscious amplification of her image. If a woman could be as brutal and effective as a man, then her ferocity was perceived as something anomalous, beyond the ordinary, and therefore more frightening. Her calmness in the bloodiest skirmishes, her willingness to plunge into the thick of a boarding where men often faltered, created an aura of invincibility. She didn't just fight, she taught a lesson. This lesson, learned by both the crew and the enemies, was simple. You are not just facing a pirate, but something more, something that does not obey familiar rules. She did not seek popularity, but her actions evoked a mix of terror and respect, which for a pirate was far more valuable. Anne Bonny, in turn, was the embodiment of uncontrolled rage, which she skillfully directed. Her famous outbursts of anger, her readiness for violence without hesitation, became part of her brand. She did not hide her cruelty. On the contrary, she flaunted it, turning every brawl, every execution into a public spectacle. Anne understood that in the world of pirates, where reputation often meant more than crew size, creating the image of a mad, unpredictable fury was a strategic move. Her aggression was not just an emotion, but a tool that kept both her own sailors and potential victims on edge. By playing on primal fear, she paralyzed the will to resist. Her influence on Rackham's crew was immense. She was not just the captain's lover, but also his fiercest and most reliable fighter, whose presence on board guaranteed maximum effectiveness in battle. She was an expert in instilling terror, and her methods were infallible. Together, their influence multiplied. Mary and Anne didn't just participate in battles, they led them, often being the first to board an enemy ship. Their fearlessness was not recklessness, it was a calculated act that inspired their own sailors and demoralized the enemy. When pirates saw two women fighting more fiercely than anyone else, it defied their expectations and caused cognitive dissonance, turning an ordinary boarding action into a surreal nightmare. This shock was a powerful psychological weapon. Their effectiveness in combat directly influenced the success of raids, and thus the amount of loot, which in turn ensured their crew's loyalty based on pure pragmatism and greed. They were the most profitable fighters, and that was an undeniable argument in their favor. Their personal adaptability was phenomenal. Mary, forced to live in constant pretense since childhood, developed incredible psychological resilience and the ability to instantly adjust to changing circumstances. She could be a soldier, a sailor, an innkeeper, and then a pirate, seamlessly integrating into each new role. Anne, with her rebellious spirit and rejection of all social norms, was a natural survivor, capable of turning any confrontation into a personal victory. These qualities, forged by years of hardship and struggle with society, became their main assets on the pirate ship. They didn't just adapt to the brutal world of the Caribbean Sea, they shaped it with their presence, their fury, and their refusal to be victims. Their past, filled with despair and forced violence, became not a stigma, but a training ground for developing the skills necessary for survival in extreme conditions. They learned not only to strike blows, but also to withstand them, not only to hide, but also to use their true nature as leverage. Ultimately, Mary Read and Anne Bonny became the embodiment of how personal trauma and forced adaptation can transform into incredible strength. Their toolkit consisted of honed psychological techniques, mastery of fear management, and a unique ability to survive, turning them from outcasts into formidable rulers of the Caribbean Sea, whose methods were as effective as they were ruthless. But even the most sophisticated manipulations and honed combat skills could not save Mary Read and Anne Bonny from the inevitable clash with a force far more powerful than any pirate captain or storm. This force arrived in the Bahamas in 1718 in the person of the new Governor Woodes Rogers, a former privateer whose own career was built on state-sanctioned legalized plunder. He arrived in New Providence with one sole mission: to ruthlessly eradicate the piracy that had turned the West Indies into a preserve of lawlessness. Rogers was no naive idealist. He perfectly understood the nature of people cornered and offered them a choice: a royal pardon for all who abandoned piracy, or the inevitable gallows. For thousands of desperate sailors and soldiers left without means of subsistence after the war, this was their only chance to return to a semblance of normal life. And many, very many, accepted this act of mercy, preferring safety, even in poverty, to the constant threat of execution. The very idea of piracy as an alternative social system, offering the illusion of freedom and equality, collided with the reality of a state machine capable of unleashing its full might upon it. Before Rogers' arrival, the true patrons and beneficiaries of piracy were not only the buccaneers themselves, but also an entire network of corrupt officials, port merchants, and smugglers. They turned a blind eye to lawlessness, or even actively facilitated it, transforming New Providence into a thriving center of illegal trade and a refuge for sea robbers. These people, greedy for pirate loot, created the very fertile ground in which captains like Jack Rackham flourished. However, with Rogers' appearance, the rules of the game changed dramatically. The governor began methodically dismantling this shadow economy, forcing former pirate accomplices either to submit to the law or to go deep underground. The choice became black and white, law or death. In this new, extremely hostile environment, Jack Rackham, Mary and Anne's captain, found himself caught between two fires. He, like many others, initially accepted Rogers' pardon, trying to fit into a world he had so long rejected. But old habits, the craving for easy money, and an inability to adapt to the discipline of peaceful life prevailed. Rackham, succumbing to temptation, once again hoisted the Jolly Roger, returning to plunder. This step was not just a crime, it was an open defiance of authority, personified by Woodes Rogers. Thus, Governor Rogers became not just an antagonist in this story, but the embodiment of the very system against which Mary Read and Anne Bonny had rebelled from birth. He was the one who methodically tightened the noose around the neck of everyone who dared to live outside the law. His arrival and subsequent actions transformed the Caribbean Sea from a boiling pot of opportunities into a vast trap, where every day became a struggle for survival, and the only prospect for those who refused the pardon was an inevitable encounter with royal justice.